Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something potentially transformative for, well, everything related to national security and how wars might be fought. Biotechnology.
We're looking at a fascinating report today. It really digs into how the U.S. military could maximize the benefits of biotech, but also, critically, how to safeguard against its misuse.
And the report starts with this really striking analogy, doesn't it? Comparing biotech now to air power back in the early 20th century.
Exactly. How planes were initially seen as maybe useful for scouting, perhaps, but not game-changing. And then, well, look what happened. The report suggests biology might be on that same kind of trajectory, a fundamental shift.
A huge shift. So that's our focus today, unpacking this report. We'll look at the ethical side, how you actually scale this stuff across the military, and, maybe most importantly, how we stop adversaries like China from turning U.S. biotech against us.
Right. A lot to cover.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start with that potential. What does the report say biotech could actually do for defense?
Well, the core idea is biology's unique ability to grow, to adapt. This could totally revolutionize military logistics, for instance.
Logistics? You mean like supply chains?
Precisely. Imagine, instead of shipping fuel or food or even essential medicines over vast, vulnerable distances.
You could.
Hmm.
What, grow them closer to where they're needed?
Kind of, yeah. On-demand production. The report mentions fuel, food, medicine specifically. Think about simplifying those incredibly complex supply lines, extending how long forces can operate independently.
That sounds like a massive strategic advantage.
Yeah.
Decoupling from those predictable choke points.
It is. But, it also brings new challenges, like securing those biomanufacturing processes themselves. It's not just a magic bullet.
Sure, makes sense. And it's not just about making stuff, right? What about things like sensing the environment?
Absolutely. Surveillance is another huge area. The report talks about biological sensors, tiny deployable sensors that could detect, say, pathogens or chemical threats in real time.
Giving commanders a much faster, clearer picture of what's happening.
Exactly. Faster detection means faster, more informed decisions. Think about spotting a biothreat before it spreads. That's game-changing.
And the report touches on even more advanced stuff, too, like camouflage.
Yeah, dynamic biological camouflage. Imagine camo that actually changes and adapts to the environment on its own.
Making soldiers or equipment much harder to spot.
Right. Or wearable biosensors monitoring a soldier's condition, maybe even adjusting mission plans based on their physiological state.
Okay, that's heading into some really complex territory, both technically and ethically, I'd imagine.
Definitely. These ideas point towards enhanced stealth, better mobility, real tactical advantages. But the report makes a really crucial point here.
Which is?
We can't just see these as separate gadgets or tools. The military needs a mindset shift.
Like the air power analogy again. Not just planes, but air power, a whole doctrine.
Precisely. Biotechnology needs to be seen as a comprehensive framework, something integrated into strategy and doctrine, not just a few neat projects in a lab.
And you mentioned potential issues, like military specifications, the mil specs, maybe not being ready for bio-based products.
Yeah, that's a practical hurdle. Old standards designed for traditional manufacturing might unintentionally block new biotech solutions.
So a systemic change is needed. Now, the DoD isn't totally new to this, is it? The report mentioned some existing efforts.
No, not starting from scratch. There's the Office of Strategic Capital. DARPA always has its biological technology office doing cutting-edge stuff. And there's also the Tri-Service Biotechnology for a Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, TBRSC.
TVRSC. That sounds like it's directly targeting those logistics issues we talked about.
It is. It's an internal military push to explore biotech for supply chain resilience. So, activity is happening.
But the report's message seems to be we need to do more, faster, and maybe connect these efforts better.
That's the gist, yes. These initiatives show awareness, but the report argues for more deliberate steps to really harness the potential and, frankly, stay ahead, which naturally leads to the next big question, scaling this up.
Right. Having cool tech in a lab is one thing. Getting it out into the field, used across the forces before adversaries do. That's the challenge.
And a core recommendation is about manufacturing. Congress should direct the DoD to partner with private companies.
To build what specifically?
Commercial-scale biomanufacturing facilities. Here, domestically. Focused on critical defense needs. It's about de-risking that domestic supply.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Is there a specific program aimed at this?
Yes, the report highlights the Distributed Bioindustrial Manufacturing Program, DBIMET. It's aiming at things like rocket propellant, jet fuel, special coatings, textiles, made through bioprocesses.
So trying to build a more spread out, resilient biomanufacturing base for defense.
That's the idea. They've started, apparently. Planning grants went out to, I think, 34 companies across the country.
Okay, phase one. But there's a snag, funding.
That looks like a big one. DBEM seems to rely on Defense Production Act, DPA funding, but the report notes there's no specific line item for it in the FY25 budget bills, which creates uncertainty.
Uh-oh, so it could stall out.
That's the concern raised. The report suggests it needs sustained funding. They put a number on it, like $762 million over 5 years. Otherwise, it might not get to building those actual facilities. And DoD needs to be really clear with industry about what it needs and when.
Communication is key, always. What about other initiatives? The report mentions BioMade.
Right, BioMay. That's a public-private partnership, also focused on scaling up domestic bioindustrial manufacturing. Congress is giving it money.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, there seems to be a hiccup with their first planned facility in Minnesota. Something about how the law is being interpreted is holding things up.
So a classic bureaucratic hurdle, potentially slowing down progress.
It looks that way. The report calls for Congress to maybe step in, provide oversight, maybe clarify the language, so BioMay can actually use the funds as intended to build these shared pre-commercial facilities.
And it gets specific about what Congress should look at.
Oh, yeah. Contract times, who gets awards, grant details, site selection, who the members are, how they're working with other agencies. Pretty detailed oversight recommendations.
Okay, let's circle back to those mil specs, the military specifications. How big a problem is that potential bias against biotech?
It could be significant. If the standards automatically favor old ways of making things, new bio-based materials might never get adopted, even if they're better.
So what's the fix?
The report suggests Congress should tell the Secretary of Defense to issue clear guidance. Like, how can a company prove its biotech product meets the intent of the spec, even if the process is different?
Makes sense. And involve the GAO.
Yes. Have the Government Accountability Office analyze the whole mil-spec process for any built-in bias against biotech, and maybe work with allies to get standards aligned internationally, too.
Okay, standards are one piece. How else do you encourage companies to invest in making these defense-focused biotech products? It sounds risky.
Very risky. That's where things like advanced market commitments, AMCs, and offtake agreements come in. The report strongly recommends using these.
Explain those a bit. What's an AMC?
Think of it as the DoD basically saying, look, if you successfully develop and produce this specific biotech product that meets our needs, we guarantee we will buy a certain amount.
Ah, so it reduces the market risk for the company. Gives them a guaranteed first customer.
Exactly. It signals clear demand. Offtake agreements are similar, maybe guaranteeing purchase of a certain volume over time. It helps companies get financing and scale up. The report mentions things like bio-based concrete or technologies for cleaning up contaminated sites bioremediation as examples.
Concrete made biologically. Interesting.
The possibilities are broad. So the recommendation is for Congress to push DoD to use its other transaction authorities, or OTAs, which are more flexible contracting mechanisms, to set up AMCs and a pilot program for these offtake agreements.
And it gets specific on who should run this.
Yes, points to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment to design and manage these programs.
Okay, so we've covered manufacturing, standards, incentives. What about the people? Does the military have the expertise?
That's another critical piece the report hits hard. We need a biotech-ready workforce, not just researchers, but people across DoD and other national security agencies who understand this stuff, especially as biotech merges with AI, quantum computing. It gets complex fast.
So training and education.
Absolutely. Congress should require agencies to figure out what skills are needed, define core competencies, then develop training for uniformed personnel, civilians, anyone dealing with biological threats or technologies.
And specialist training, too.
Yes, courses at places like the National Intelligence University, training for people at DHS Customs and Border Protection, Homeland Security Investigations, TSA, and the FBI, especially on spotting illicit tech transfer.
Makes sense. Stopping the tech from leaking out is as important as developing it. The report also mentions a NASEM study.
Briefly, yeah. A National Academies report that also looked at biotech R&D for defense and recommended something called the Biocatalyst Network, likely another push for coordinated research.
Got it. Okay, this feels like a good point to shift gears. We've talked potential, we've talked scaling. Now the really thorny issue, preventing misuse by adversaries, especially China.
Right, and the report prefaces this by reiterating the long-standing U.S. policy. We banned offensive biological weapons way back in 1969. We led the charge on the UN Biological Weapons Convention.
We don't make bioweapons, period.
Correct. But the report highlights serious concerns that not everyone plays by those rules. Russia, North Korea are mentioned as possibly still pursuing them.
And China.
The concern with China is different, tied to its military-civil fusion strategy. The assessment mentioned is that some of their dual-use research with both civilian and potential military applications might be crossing the line, potentially violating the BWC.
Military-civil fusion, MASCF. That's the strategy aiming to basically erase the lines between their civilian tech sector and the military, right?
Exactly, which makes it really hard to know if civilian biotech research might be diverted for military aims. It raises big questions.
So given that landscape, the U.S. absolutely needs strong defenses.
Not just strong, but adaptable. The report stresses developing defensive tech against threats from both nation-states and non-state actors, like terrorist groups. And a key part of that is early detection.
Detection. Back to those sensors.
Yes, but specifically pathogen-agnostic detection, meaning systems that can detect a novel or unknown biological threat quickly without needing to know exactly what it is beforehand. Scalable early warning is crucial.
Okay, so defense is key. But what about preventing adversaries from getting our tech in the first place? The report talks about investment flows.
Right. A major recommendation is for Congress to mandate rules on outbound investment, basically stopping U.S. money from flowing into Chinese companies developing specific biotechnologies that could pose a national security risk.
Is that happening now? U.S. investment going into potentially risky Chinese biotech?
Well, that's part of the problem. The report says we lack a clear picture. Apparently, a lot of these investment transactions don't even report the financial details, maybe around 20%, so it's hard to track the flow of U.S. capital into sensitive areas.
And we have outbound investment rules for things like semiconductors and AI, but not biotech.
That's what the report indicates. Existing efforts haven't included biotech. So the recommendation is start with mandatory notification. U.S. investors have to report investments in certain biotech categories going to countries of concern.
Just notification initially.
Yes. Then a year later, a report back to Congress. That report would then inform whether stronger measures are needed, like actually screening or even prohibiting certain investments. It's a phased approach.
Trying to avoid inadvertently funding potential threats. What about controlling the export of actual equipment or know-how?
Also critical. The report suggests Congress direct the Department of Commerce to consider countrywide export controls on very specific, highly sophisticated U.S. biotech items.
Countrywide, like we did with advanced semiconductor tech to China.
Similar idea. The current system often relies on judging exports case by case, which can be slow and maybe easier to get around. Countrywide controls would be broader.
But the report notes biotech is different from chips, right?
It does. Controlling biotech isn't just about stopping machines from being shipped. So much of it is about the know-how, the processes, the data, the human expertise. It's much slipperier, harder to control than a physical chip.
Like trying to control an idea versus a thing.
Exactly. So export controls need to be really smart, really agile. It means government and industry need to work together in a new way. And crucially, work with allies. If the U.S. restricts something but our allies don't, it doesn't work.
International cooperation is essential. Okay, besides controls, how else can the military prepare for this bio-enabled future?
Wargaming. The report recommends Congress require DoD to actually incorporate biotech scenarios into its big war games, like the annual globally integrated war games.
So simulate what happens if an adversary or even U.S. forces has these advanced bio capabilities.
Right. Play it out. See what challenges arise, what opportunities emerge, how does it change strategy, tactics, doctrine. It helps anticipate the future and integrate biotech thinking into actual war planning. And they suggest coordinating this with the Office of Global Competition Analysis.
Makes sense practice for the possibilities. Finally, what about intelligence? Knowing what adversaries are actually doing.
Hugely important. The report stresses resourcing the intelligence community, CIA, DIA, FBI, NSA, ODNI, to make understanding adversary biotech development a top priority.
So giving them the money and people they need to track this.
Yes, and having them report back regularly to Congress on what resources they need. Interestingly, the report notes the 2025 defense bill already has something in it requiring the IC to develop a strategy for countering foreign adversary use of biotech. So there's alignment there.
Good to see some action already happening.
Well,
Anything else major on prevention?
The report briefly mentions the Biotechnology Tech Hubs program, part of the SHE-PS Act, I believe. Not strictly prevention, but building up our own domestic innovation ecosystem is itself a form of strategic advantage.
Right, strengthening our own base. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've gone through a lot from this report.
We have. The overarching theme seems clear. Biotech offers truly revolutionary possibilities for defense. It could change logistics, surveillance, soldier performance, a lot.
But it's not simple. It requires a really thoughtful approach. Defining ethical lines is critical.
Absolutely. Getting those principles right, especially around things like enhancing warfighters or environmental impacts.
And then there's the whole challenge of actually implementing it, scaling up manufacturing here at home, getting past bureaucratic hurdles like mil-specs, building the right workforce.
And doing all that while being incredibly vigilant about preventing misuse, particularly keeping sensitive tech out of the hands of adversaries like China through smarter investment rules and export controls.
It really feels like a pivotal moment, similar to that air power analogy.
Hmm.
The U.S. needs to act decisively now, according to this report, to shape this technological revolution in line with our interests and values.
It argues we can't afford to be slow or reactive. Leadership in biotech is crucial for future national security.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over, building on everything we've discussed. How do we strike that critical balance, the balance between pushing innovation forward in biotechnology because it's vital for our security and putting effective guardrails in place to prevent its misuse? What do you think are the biggest challenges ahead in walking that tightrope? Something to consider. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.